Thank you very much, everybody, for coming along. My name's Rory Collins, and I'm the head of the Nuffield Department of Population Health. Nick suggested I should explain why a department that's interested in population health research and implementing better health in the public would host an event on truth in the media. And the obvious reason is that there is so much misinformation about health in the media. Perhaps the most notorious example is that of Andrew Wakefield and MMR and autism, published in The Lancet in 1998 with a press conference that led to a worldwide scare about the risks of vaccination against measles, mumps, and rubella. It took 12 years before that paper was retracted, and the GMC struck off Andrew Wakefield. In between, in 2002, the BBC Panorama programme had a very sympathetic programme about Wakefield, which helped to support that. And what we saw was a large reduction in vaccination rates, increases in a disease that had been largely eradicated, measles, and it continues to be a problem. Only last year, Robert Kennedy Jr. and Robert De Niro offered a $100,000 prize to whoever who could prove that the MMR vaccine was safe. And in fact, apparently Trump had been considering having Robert Kennedy Jr., an anti-vaxxer, run an inquiry into its safety. So far, that hasn't happened. But the problem, I think, is it took 12 years for it to be retracted, and when it was retracted on a technicality. He was struck off for not declaring conflicts of interest, not for scientific misconduct. A little bit like Al Capone getting sent to Alcatraz for not paying his tax. In Al Capone's case, he died of syphilis in Alcatraz. So far, Andrew Wakefield prospers. And in fact, what has happened is, by not dealing with the problem rapidly, it has become an increasingly big problem. So the second reason why I'm interested from a health point of view was that there's lots talked about fake news, about what it is, about the impact it has. But what I found special about Nick's book was that he tried to understand the causes of it. That there had been a change in the ownership of the media, moving from people who were interested in news to people who were interested in making money. Cutting the journalists, cutting the checking, reducing the quality control. I think he refers to it as journalism, with press releases just being put out there without the ability to check them. And from the less obvious perspective of health, in dealing with disease, it really helps to understand the causes, to prevent it and to treat it. And again, with disease, typically the most effective way of dealing with the disease is not through treatment, it's through prevention. If we want to deal with lung cancer, it's getting people not to start smoking, getting them to stop smoking, not to try and treat their lung cancer. And so I'm interested in whether the same thing is true of dealing with fake news. And it was for that reason that I wanted to ask Nick to come and talk to us, and Alan to talk about how one deals with the problem, particularly in the internet age. This book was published in 2008, but things have clearly not got better. So Alan and Nick, thank you very much. Okay.
I should just briefly explain that Nick and I have known each other a very long time. We both joined The Guardian on the same day in 1979, and he stayed being a reporter, really, and I sat behind a desk. But we did a lot together in the last 10 years while I was editing The Guardian, and I think Nick is one of my great journalistic heroes. And did amazing work including, but not only, 7 years on the incredible story about phone hacking, which led to these two books. One, Flat Earth News, and what was the other one called?
He's read it, he's memorized it, he's read it to his children.
It was a really good book.
I can't remember either.
I can't remember.
No,
It was
it's
a good
called
book
Hack
anyway.
Attack.
So I'm going to, Nick wants to make this a conversation, but he's a better talker than I am, so I will mainly ask
Mind you,
him
he has no
stuff.
experience in interviewing people.
So I'm mainly going to ask him stuff, but he may ask me stuff too, and it's not at all artificial. We thought this was going to be a pub, incidentally, above a pub. We had no idea we were going to be here. And I think probably because this is such an enormous topic, and there are so many clever people thinking about the sort of social media bit of it, which is obviously huge. But I think maybe the most important bit that we can talk about tonight is actually the failings of mainstream media. But we will end up talking about social media as well.
Okay.
So what do you understand about, what do you understand by the term fake news?
Okay, so first of all, I think the expression fake news is unhelpful. It's a cliche, okay, it's new, but it's still a cliche. Cliches are dangerous because they denote shortcuts of thinking as well as shortcuts of language. So I don't even know what it means. At best, it means nothing, and it isn't clear. At worst, it means something to do with hostile agencies, probably Russian, fabricating stories on social media. And it doesn't begin to capture what's going on. I should say, okay, we've known each other nearly 40 years. The weird thing is we've never had a crossword, but we might try tonight for these people to have an argument. So my opening bid would be this. It ain't about fake news. That's too tiny and muddled. What's happened is that in the last 5 or 10 years, collectively, we crossed the line into an era of information chaos. So it's much, much bigger than fake news tells you. And you have now all kinds of different channels of communication flooded with falsehood, pretending to be truth. And it pours through these channels of communication and out into public policy, government policy, into popular culture, personal behavior. And it's a big, big thing. And because it affects all of that alarmingly long list of problems that are so frightening, climate change, Middle Eastern war, Islamist terrorism, Russian nuclear missiles, Chinese expansionism, all of it is polluted with misinformation, and all of the reaction to it is equally polluted. Could you live with something as apocalyptical as that?
That's a good start, yeah.
And then you're agreeing with you.
I remember I gave a talk in Sheffield about 2005, before Facebook and social media really got going. And then the thing that worried me was a world without news, because it seemed to me we were losing the ability to finance what you and I have done all our lives. And local newspapers would die first. Well, that turned out to be true. They're dying, and then eventually it would reach other forms of news. But in fact, what's actually happened is become worse than that. It's not that there's no news, there's too much news. But it's distinguishing between what is true and what is untrue.
Okay.
And I was in this theatre the other night, 2 nights ago, when the professor at the Oxford Internet Institute, Philip Howard, was saying that they can now measure in the United States the proportion of true information to fake information is now 1-to-1 in America on social media channels. In Britain, it's 1-to-4 in the right way, so 4 true to 1 untrue. In Germany, 4-to-1, France, 7-to-1. But that seems to me a really frightening statistic, 1-to-1.
It is. I still don't think it captures the badness of it. Let's try and fill in a big picture. If we think of these channels of communication being polluted by misinformation, there are at least 3 big pumps, so to speak, working away in the background. So the first, very significant, but actually the least in order, if we start with the small and build up big, is propaganda. Now, with all of these 3 pumps I want to talk about, none of them is new, but all of them, you might not agree with this, has been made enormously much more destructive by the internet. I think we're getting to the point with the internet where it's a bit like nuclear missiles. We think that was very clever of us to invent it, but maybe we would have been better off not doing it. Agree with that?
I don't agree with that, but keep going.
So propaganda is very old. Propaganda is organizations, probably military and intelligence agencies, but not necessarily, deliberately fabricating false stories, masquerading as true stories in order to achieve some political, diplomatic, or military objective. That's propaganda. And you can see, if you look at it since 1945, it's moved through various very interesting phases. So, courtesy of two committees on Capitol Hill, one chaired by Frank Church, you remember that senator, and another by Otis Pike, and some really good journalism, some of it done by Carl Bernstein of Watergate fame. We know a lot about the propaganda machine that was in place during the Cold War. And it's fair to say on the basis of all that evidence that during those years, the biggest news organization in the world was not the Associated Press, which is what the official answer would be. It was the CIA. The Associated Press Agency had reporters in about 120 countries. Well, there are about 200 countries in the world. Whereas the CIA had media assets in every single country in the planet and was using them to pump out propaganda, fabricated stories. As a single example, you might remember the Pope being shot in the Vatican by a crazy Turk who belonged to a group called the Grey Wolves. Well, the CIA used their network of newspapers to put out false stories connecting him to Bulgarian intelligence. It was the Russians what did it. Now, when the Cold War ended, that vast apparatus of official misinformation had its budget cut and it died away. And then, September 2001, an enormous new structure was created. And I had this weird experience when I was researching this book, that because the whole world had been Thatcherized and privatized, there's this conference in London of spooks and military people from all the NATO countries coming to discuss what they now call strategic communications. It's what you and I call propaganda. And they were selling tickets. So I filled in a form. There was a nice guy in British military intelligence who was helping me. He pointed out this thing was there with its door open. So I filled in this form saying, Nick Davies, Guardian, which sounds like a security company, paid £1,000. Actually, Alan Rusbridger paid £1,000. I got it on expenses. And I was suddenly in the middle of this conference. And after about half an hour, they suddenly realized that there was a journo, an awful old hack in their midst. And they stopped everything. What the fuck's going on? And I said, well, you can't throw me out. I've got a contract with you. I've paid money. It would be a breach of contract for you to chuck me out. So they said, oh. So I was allowed to stay, and I was allowed to identify the people who were there. And I was allowed to say what was said on the understanding that I didn't hook the quotes up to the individuals. Because if I'd gone beyond that, I think they were going to kill me. Some of them were, that type. But so this was really, really interesting because these were very clever people. There's a lot of senior US military people, NATO people. They've got at least 2 degrees. These are not thickos with tattoos. And their job was to manipulate mainstream media. And the more you listened to them, the more you could see how easy it was. And I tracked some of it in that book. There was fascinating stuff around Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq. He wasn't the leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq. He existed, and he was an extremely unpleasant man. But he was essentially a propaganda vehicle to convey the idea that the insurrection by Iraqis was, in fact, the work of foreign fighters. The most important thing about Zarqawi is that he's a Jordanian. He's not an Iraqi. So we consistently blame everything on this Jordanian. It's foreign fighters. Just as a single example of how easy it is to get away with that. The first time he really surfaced publicly was when Colin Powell made that extraordinary presentation to the UN Security Council in February 2003 to justify the invasion. An extraordinary tissue of lies. And in that he talked about how Saddam Hussein was linked to al-Qaeda. And the concrete evidence of this was that this very senior al-Qaeda guy, Zarqawi, had been injured in Afghanistan and had been operated on in Baghdad by Saddam's surgeons, who'd saved his life, although they'd had to remove one of his legs. Well, a few months later, when those poor guys in orange jumpsuits were being beheaded in front of the camera, that too, it was Zarqawi with the black mask and the knife. And it showed you how good Saddam Hussein's surgeons were, because he'd sprouted a second leg. But it was easy. Nobody in the press said, hang on a minute, I can count up to 2. There's something wrong with this story. What were you going to say?
Well, okay, that's all fascinating, but I suppose to bring it...
That was patronizing, did you think? Yeah.
You've had 40 years of being patronized by me. You can take it. So why is it so easy? Why?
Okay,
if
well,
you've
we'll
got
come
all
to
these, why come to that now. So why have you got,
Okay.
the magnificent estate that is the press? Why is it so easy to fool them?
Okay. I've got one more line on propaganda, a single sentence, which is that once you've got social media, it's clear that the distribution capacity of that machine is bigger than ever. So if, looking back to the Cold War, it was the biggest news machine in the world, introduced this thing after September 2001, it's massive, and now it's got social media. It's everywhere, ain't just Russian, plenty of Western stuff. Look at Netanyahu on Iranian nuclear things just the other day. Okay. Okay, let's come to the mainstream media, since he insists. Really, the thesis there is that if you suck the funding out of news organizations, a lot of people may think, well, that's fine. Journalists are rather horrible people. Who cares if they lose their jobs? The real problem is that they become structurally vulnerable to manipulation. So if you ask people outside of our profession, why would newspapers, for example, all over the planet, why would news organizations of every kind tell their readers, viewers, listeners that there were weapons of mass destruction all over Iraq? They tend to come up with conspiracy theories. Well, this is the proprietors who are ideologues, and they lean down from on high and they tell obedient journalists what to write, and these compliant puppets do as they're told. And there is some of that. There are media proprietors who will interfere, but the scale on which they do it is actually very small, very disappointing to the conspiracy theorists. That is not the core of what's going on at all. There's another bunch of people who say, well, it's the advertisers. You need their money, they tell you what to say. Or you need their money and they therefore impose on you some sort of need to comply with capitalist ideology. And that, I mean, that's very, very unusual to find advertisers interfering successfully in newspapers. There was a big row at the Telegraph, it was at HSBC, which caused such Peter Oben resigned, you know, the political correspondent. It's very unusual. The point is that we are structurally likely nowadays to produce falsehood and distortion and propaganda. So I'd have to fill in a few statistics.
Just explain why.
I will. Okay. So when I was researching this book, I raised some money from the Rowntree Foundation, gave it to long-suffering academics in Cardiff, and they did some research for me. Step one, a very crude but interesting piece of research. They went back through the annual reports of all the Fleet Street companies and made some phone calls to track the number of journalists that national newspapers had been employing during the 20 years before we produced the book. Then they went to the newspaper library with tape measures, and they measured the editorial space in newspapers that those journalists were filling as the years went by. And as a crude bottom line figure, what they discovered was that in the current time, the Fleet Street journalists, on average, were filling 3 times as much space as they had been 20 years earlier. That's because the number of journalists in the newsroom had been cut and the output had been increased. Now, if you flip that around and look at it from an operational point of view, what it means is that as a crude average, journalists had only 1/3 of the time they used to have to work on each story. Now, if you take time away from reporters, journalists, it's like taking steel away from the people who manufacture cars. That's what we work with. Time is our primary working asset. Very bad things start to happen if you do this to newsrooms. So then, we get the long-suffering academics at Cardiff to do a study of the output of the 4 quality UK national newspapers over, I think it was a 2-week period, several thousand stories. This was UK home news. So this was Guardian, Times, Independent, Telegraph, and we added the Daily Mail. It isn't a quality newspaper, but it's pretty powerful. So those 5 papers, they're domestic news coverage. And they were actually in the Guardian newsroom, you may remember, because the first question that we wanted to ask of these thousands of stories was, where does the information come from? And specifically, how much of it is actually generated in the way that it should be by reporters running around and asking questions? And so they did an enormous amount of work in the newsroom following up with reporters. And here's what they found. With 8% of the stories, they just couldn't quite be sure where it had come from because there's off-the-record sources. With only 12% of the stories was the material in those stories being generated by reporters asking questions. A tiny, tiny fraction. 80% of the material in those stories was coming from 2 second-hand sources. That's wire copy. The news agencies like the Press Association for the UK Reuters and the AP for the rest of the world. So wire copy, and secondly, the public relations industry. Now, just put those two on one side, and then come for a moment to the second thing that they discovered. They analyzed all those stories in detail, and they said, is there evidence that the central proposition of each of these stories has been checked? Now, the key objective of journalism is to try to tell the truth. Therefore, the key function is checking. That's what we do for a living. So that you know the answer you're going to get, 100%. Or maybe on a bad day, it's going to come down to 90, 80. You know the result they came up with? 12. 12% of those stories showed evidence of being checked. Now, come back to the two primary sources. 80% of the materials coming from these second-hand sources. You look at the wire agencies first. I know a lot of reporters who work for those agencies. They're good people. They're professional. They're hardworking. Some of them are very brave. But then talk to them about what their job is. Is your job to tell the truth? Well, actually, they say it's not. It's not about truth. It's about accuracy. That's a different thing. Our job at an agency is to tell news organizations what people are saying. It is absolutely not our job to start challenging them. That's not what an agency does. The book, for example, quotes Jonathan Grun, who was the head of PA at the time. Accuracy. So if the Prime Minister stands up and says there are weapons of mass destruction all over North Oxford, that is what the good agency will report. It's up to the news organizations to check whether it's true. 12%, remember that. There's a second problem with news agencies, which is that they can't tell you the truth about the world because they don't know it. So AP, for example, at its most powerful, at its wealthiest, had people in only 120 countries. That's 80 countries where they've got nobody. And they are equally powerful in television news. If you look at television news, the number of countries where neither AP nor Reuters has anyone is vast. It includes places like Saudi Arabia, Canada, these are the Congo. These are newsworthy countries. The agencies on whom newspapers rely for their coverage don't have anybody there. A bomb goes off in Riyadh. Reuters get onto the local TV company. Have you got any footage? Yes. Here's 90 seconds. There's a burning car. There's a shoe with blood in it lying in a gutter. Here are some police arriving on the scene. And here's a paragraph which we give to Reuters. And so then we tell you a bomb went off in Riyadh yesterday. Who put it there? Why? What does it mean? We don't know. How can we tell you the truth? We're not there. The agencies aren't there. Even if they are there, they're trying to be accurate, not tell us the truth. It ain't good enough to rely on news agencies. There are some other problems in there, but I can feel Alan twitching. The other more important second-hand source is the PR industry. And this is where, in a sense, the statistic that he just gave you about 50% of US news being fake doesn't get you to the heart of the matter. So, while the money has been sucked out of newsrooms over the years, over on the other side of the line, the public relations industry has been getting more and more powerful. So when we started as reporters a long time ago, 40 years ago, it was rather unusual to come across press officers. I worked on local papers in Devon and Cornwall. If I wanted to do a story with the police, I'd ring a police station and speak to the duty sergeant. At some point, let's say 10 years into that, just about any individual or organization who anticipated that they would have press coverage started to surround themselves with press officers. In the beginning, this was rather a delightful system because the press officers would be kind of retired nobodies who didn't really know what was going on. And so when the reporters called them and said what's going on, they literally couldn't tell them. They had no idea what the truth was. So that was pretty safe. But then you went into a second phase, symbolized by the work of Alistair Campbell, where organizations realized that it wasn't enough to conceal what they were doing. What they wanted to do was to get out there and manipulate coverage. So the press officer suddenly was moved into the center. And there's Alistair Campbell sitting next to the Prime Minister in the meeting. There's the press officer next to the Chief Constable, to the Chief Executive. And taking part in meetings. No, let's not do that because that won't play well with the press. Actually engineering the decision-making. So they become very significant people. Okay, so there's more and more of these guys. Now, and remember that the PR and the wire are accounting for 80% of the material we're handling. It's huge. If you ask what's wrong with covering PR material, part of it is that some PR material is lies. Now, people get very upset if you say that, but that is the reality. There's experienced reporters all over this room. We've all had it, that if you put a PR officer in a corner and confront them with uncomfortable information and keep pushing, sooner or later they'll tell you a lie. More than that, there is material put out by the PR industry that's false from the word go. We could give you examples. But beyond that, it isn't a sufficient defense for the PR industry to say that story we gave you yesterday is true. Because you now live in a world where government departments, corporations, trade unions, NGOs, celebrities decide what news organizations are going to tell about them, what stories they're going to write. It isn't enough. So if you were chief press officer of Oxfordshire Police and you come into work in the morning and there on the log there's 2 bits of information. Number 1, last night a senior police officer was so drunk that he had to be sent home in a staff car. Number 2, at noon today, a young police constable will be given a medal because she rescued a baby from a burning building. Now, you have to decide which of these 2 stories to feed out to the local newspapers. And you needn't spend very long about it. It's absolutely obvious, so we'll write. And just understand, the press officer will write the story about the medal and the baby, and will then include a photograph of the smiling police constable, and will then include quotes from the police constable that have never been near the police constable's mouth, and they will go out. And I, for a while, was involved in a campaign to stop a horrible dual carriageway being built through my part of Sussex. And I used to write press releases, and they would come into the local paper verbatim, as I had written them. And that's the experience of lots of PR people across the board. Okay? And this stuff isn't being checked. So can you see how we become structurally likely to produce falsehood and distortion? And the propaganda machine, to a considerable extent, is able to use the same channels that the PR people at the front of the Pentagon or the Ministry of Defense get used to push out what the military and spooks are conjuring up. So you end up with, I think I've said this already, but news organizations who are structurally likely not to be able to tell the truth. Does that help?
That was a very good answer.
It's rather long.
It was long, but have a drink. Because I think that we have got to the nub of the problem at the moment. Because in a way, social media, criticizing social media is easy. Mm-hmm. But the defense of journalists is, yes, all that's rubbish, but we're here and we're professionals, and you should pay us because we're going to pump out the truth, and we can distinguish ourselves from what you do because we're over here. And I've just written a book too, which hasn't come out yet, but it's going to come out in September, and it's called Breaking News. That's a pun. And it was looking at the last 20 years of this tension between mainstream news and alternative forms of news. And I thought it was going to be an easy book to write because I thought, well, you know, in the end, it's all about journalism, and journalism is the patch of ground we fight on. But as I was writing it during the Brexit referendum, and looking at the way that Brexit was covered, I thought, well, I know what I want journalists to do is to tell me that case and that case as neutrally as possible, so I can make it my own mind up, and that didn't happen. And then you watched the election of Trump, and increasingly I thought, well, what unites the BBC and the Daily Mail? They seem to be doing completely different things. Fox News, New York Times, completely different ideas of what journalism is. I could ask you about objectivity. I won't, but because I know what your answer is, you're going to say there's no such thing as objectivity. If there was a BBC journalist here, they would say, you're completely wrong. There is such a thing as objectivity. So I taught
lots of BBC journalists. I've subverted the whole thing.
So what you've got is a craft of journalism which the practitioners of the craft can't even agree what it is. At the same time as they're saying, we are the answer to the problem of fake news because what we do is so much better. So the frightening thing about the position, the thing you're describing, we haven't even got onto the economic crisis facing the press, and whether there is a financial model that's going to survive, enabled to survive. You're describing really a press that is not up to the job of combating the oceans of fake news that is out there.
Yeah, and I should have said that this book is, first of all, I don't want to sell this book. Alan, if I sold a copy of the book, I get 60 pence. Alan and I are going to pass a hat around afterwards. We think we're going to do much better out of that. So if I refer to the book, it really is just, I've just been reading it. It's not bad. It was written 10 years ago. It's got cobwebs on it. The problem that I was trying to describe that leads to this recycling of unchecked second-hand material, journalism, has, I would say, got much, much worse because of the impact of the internet just breaking the business model on which journalism has survived since the Industrial Revolution. So my guess is it's got much worse. And you can see it from the silly little stories, the PR puffs, the city pages are usually full of them, right up to the big stuff. Could we do a quick Skripal detour? Salisbury, nerve gas.
Yeah, go on, yeah.
Because that's an important story with massive ramifications. Ewan, are you walking out in protest? Oh, okay. I think that Salisbury nerve gas is a very interesting example of collective journalistic failure. I can't find a single newspaper, including The Guardian, doing the job properly. So, and because it's contemporary, just look at it. And this is at the top end of the scale, obviously. So first of all, I don't have any problem in saying that Vladimir Putin and his cronies are gangsters who are ransacking the Russian economy to enrich themselves and their families. The Panama Papers is eloquent on the subject. I don't have any problem in saying that Putin and some of his cronies are murderers. Above my desk at home, I have a picture of Anna Politkovskaya, incredibly brave Russian journalist who was murdered as she came home from a supermarket because she was upsetting the Kremlin with her reporting. But look at what we know about Salisbury, and look at what the newspapers aren't doing because they're engaging in journalism. And the most interesting source on this is the Prime Minister. So a day or two after those two poor people were attacked, she stood up in the House of Commons and she referred to something I'd never heard of before. Most of us haven't. Novichok, this Russian nerve gas. And she says it's Russian. There's only two possible explanations for Novichok being used. Not one, two. And she says the first is the Kremlin ordered a murder. Well, okay, if that turns out to be the truth, by all means, expel 23 diplomats and launch a war of words. But what's this other explanation the Prime Minister thinks could be true? Well, she says the Russians may have lost control of their stockpile of nerve gas. Well, that's interesting, and that's not a new idea. If you go back to the Yeltsin era, the Soviet Union is collapsing, and all sorts of pompous experts in the Ministry of Defense and the Pentagon are saying these Russians are going to lose control of their stockpiles of nuclear, biological, and chemical whatnots. So the first thing that a newspaper does when that is said, because understand, this is not Theresa sitting in the back of a taxi thinking, what should I say when I get to the House of Commons? This has been worked on by the Joint Intelligence Committee. All the spook agencies have contributed to this. She's saying that because she has to, because it really is a possibility. So you send a reporter out to get close to the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons and anybody else in the world of academics who knows about chemical weapons and nerve gas, and you find out, is it true that there were leaks from that stockpile? If so, what do we know about who got them? Is it possible that they really did get into the hands of organized crime groups in Russia? Right, hold that there. Now, let's think about Mr. Skripal. And what you're supposed to do if you're a journalist and not a churnalist is you're constantly going to your imagination. Your imagination is your guide. And you're always going, what about, hang on, if A is true, what about B? So, you imagine, you're Vladimir Putin, you're sitting in your office, feet on the desk, a bit of Tchaikovsky in the background, and you think, I might kill someone. Who shall I kill? I know it's going to cause trouble, but I feel like killing someone. Okay, well, there is this guy Skripal. Now, what do we know about Skripal? 2006, we found out that although he was in Russian military intelligence, he was secretly working for MI6, so we killed him. No, we didn't kill him. We arrested him, prosecuted him. When he was convicted, we didn't sentence him to death. We didn't even sentence him to life. We gave him 13 years in prison. And then only 4 years later, when there was that amazing story about the long-term Russian sleepers being found in America, we said, oh, you can have Skripal, if we can have, and 2 or 3 others, and if we can have those 10 back. And since then, 8 years have passed. So why, sitting in my study with the Tchaikovsky, do I decide now to murder Skripal? I'm not saying it wasn't the Kremlin. It may well have been Vladimir, but if it was, there's a chunk missing from the story. Skripal must have been up to something that put him up in Manchester City, not Crystal Palace, in terms of the league table of murder victims. And we don't know what it is. And I haven't found a single report of a single journalist asking this very, very obvious question. But stick with Mr. Skripal. So he gets over here in 2010. MI6 say, here's rather a dull red brick house on the edge of a really very dull city. I grew up there, Salisbury. I mean, it's pretty, but there ain't a lot going on. And you can have a stipend, there you are, you'll survive, you can go to Waitrose every so often. What does Skripal do? I mean, I don't know. I want to make it clear, nobody has any right to do what they did to that man and his daughter. But wouldn't it be interesting to know, imagination, if he was trying to earn a living by running some business? And if he was running a business, where would he go to do it? Wouldn't he contact his homeland, where he's got the contacts, where he's got the language? Is it possible? Remember, journalists in the old days used to ask questions. Is it possible that this man was involved in a business deal in Russia that alienated people, that seriously pissed them off? And that if it's true that there was a leak from the stockpile of nerve gas, as the Prime Minister says is possible, that those people decided to have a go at him. So I am not saying that that's the truth. I don't know what the truth is any more than you do, but nor do all those hacks on national newspapers, including, I'm sorry to say, The Guardian, who have done the most dangerous thing that hacks ever can do. They've moved in a herd. They're all running around. They're like cows. If you're walking across a field and meet a single cow, you're safe. A journalist on his own is usually safe. Once they start stampeding around in herds, they get dangerous. And it's awful. I mean, are you with me here? The collapse of journalism around that story. Why have we expelled 23 diplomats when the Prime Minister herself says there's an alternative explanation? I haven't seen a single report that's gone into it. That's really serious. Do you want to agree with me?
Yeah. What am I agreeing with?
There's been a basic collapse of journalism. All
Any second now, I think we'll go to the audience because I know you'll all have lots of questions. But before we get, we should say there are fantastic journalists who are still working, and so we should mention Carol Cadwallader of the Observer and the fact that she sort of broke open the Cambridge Analytica story. We should mention Millie Gentleman and the work that she's done on Windrush. We should mention Ian Bain and the work that he's done on the story that terminated yesterday with the apology to the person we sent back to being tortured in Libya. Yeah. So there's still good work being done.
There are lots of good journalists out there. It's funny, when this book was published, various old, it was like I said at the time, it was like shining a light on dark corner full of reptiles, which was these, not you, but some certain senior editors, the word Dacre comes to mind, started hissing and like this, how dare you write about us? And that was slightly frightening, actually. Dacre is just frightening. But in the background, masses and masses of journalists from this country and around the world saying, God, you got in touch. Saying, thank God you wrote that. It's the same here. I sit at my desk, I recycle this crap. I have no idea whether what I'm writing is true. But there are very good journalists out there trapped in bad organizations, not allowing them to do their work. And
the only thing that, before we started, we have a sort of slightly different view about social media, because the other thing I thought in writing this book is that now I'm not editing a paper. I mean, we know there's so much bad information on social media, but there's fantastic information on social media too, and medics and lawyers and police people and military people. I mean, there are so many people who have just decided, actually, I want to take this business of communication to my own hands, and quite often they are better than journalists and more knowledgeable and more expert.
No, you're right. We disagree.
But that is true. That's true.
Well, that was my other pump that you wouldn't let me get to. Is a few years ago, I went to listen to Tim Berners-Lee, who created the World Wide Web. And he was a man expressing considerable disappointment about the way that things had worked out. And he talked about how in the early days of constructing the web, or creating it, he could visualize a world of universal connectivity. This is the expression he uses. And that's there. But what has also emerged is something much more dangerous than that I think is more powerful. And there's an important point to make about this. So, ever since the Industrial Revolution, people in the developed world have been able to buy news that suited their prejudice. The World Wide Web, social media, allows people not just to consume the news that suits them, but to generate it. So then you get these information whirlpools. It ain't universal connectivity. So here are the racists fabricating racist news to be consumed by other racists, and round it goes. And here are the Catholics doing their bit, and here are the Trotskyites doing their bit, and then the people who believe the world is being controlled by the Illuminati. It's a kind of psychosis in these groups that has nothing to do with evidence. And the important point is, It's very easy to point at Brexit voters and Trump supporters and say, oh, what foolish people consuming all this falsehood. But it happens across the board. There are well-meaning Guardian readers producing and ingesting falsehood and enjoying every moment of it, and they get very, very upset if you try to separate them. So, for example, homeopathy. Repeatedly there have been solid experiments which say the medical value of homeopathy is placebo plus 0. But you try in my hometown down in Sussex, persuading the sandal-wearing Guardian readers who use homeopathic medicine that that's true. They are not interested in evidence. Or we had quite a rough bust-up, being attacked, where I wrote about a huge police operation into investigating sex trafficking. It had gone on for 6 months. It involved every police force in the country and various government ministries busting sex traffickers. And at the end of the operation, the then Home Secretary and a Chief Constable said, we've busted 536 of these people. And for various reasons, I was a bit suspicious of what they were saying. So I used the Freedom of Information Act to get the internal reports from the police inquiry. It's supposed to take 28 days to get something through on the Freedom of Information Act. It took 9 months. They were kicking and screaming and complaining. And when we got it, it showed that they hadn't found 531 sex traffickers. The biggest sex trafficking operation in the history of this country, 6 months, had found a total of 0. Not 1. Because women become prostitutes primarily because of poverty across the world. And lots of people choose to do something they don't want to do to earn a living. Some poor women choose to do something they don't want to do in order to send money back to their homes. Okay. There was a huge rumpus within the Guardian building because, understandably, a lot of people, including Guardian reading women, think no woman in her right mind would do that. It must surely be happening only because there's a man forcing her to, the sex trafficker. And I'm not saying that it has never happened that a woman's been forced into prostitution. I have actually somebody in my family tree who was forced into prostitution. Sure, it can happen, but that is not the core of what's going on with prostitution. Now, so first of all, there was an enormous opposition from within the office that we would publish this story, which is based on the police's own internal documents. It's not me having a drunken outburst. And then when we published it, an onslaught. How dare you deny the reality of sex trafficking? So I'm just trying to say, don't fall into the trap of imagining it's only the fools on the other hill who are engaged in this process. It seems to me that all of us are somewhat psychologically inclined to think that we know what we think. And we're all getting pulled into this poisonous world of information whirlpools on the internet. And part of, if we get round to solutions, is to become emotionally strong enough and intellectually capable of saying, actually, I just got that wrong. I need to change my mind.